Hi, Thomas. Nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you.
So we're doing this for SOLA Network, and I know you wrote a lot of articles for SOLA. I know you have your podcast and things like that. You write for TGC as well, right? I've seen a couple.
No, not yet. Did not get invited.
Oh, not yet. Okay,
not
well,
yet.
Ready to start this?
Add that in there.
Okay, well, what I want to say is that you're excellent at observing culture, at least from what I've read, okay, from your articles.
Thank you.
What do you see are some of the trends in the Asian American churches?
In the Asian American church in particular, I think one big trend to watch out for is the emerging younger generation. I think before we're used to a lot of the boomers and Gen Xers leading in the way that's very boomer and Gen Xer, and that's just kind of presumed as the way. But one thing I'm noticing a lot is as I see millennials and Gen Z not just be congregation members, but they're actually becoming like the pastors and on staff and leadership positions. They see church radically differently because their context is radically different. It's a lot less Christianized. They're more distant from that immigrant church experience that's there. And so I feel like those generational gaps are going to be a lot more pronounced, especially as they're taking positions of leadership. And you're going to see it emerge in ways that it just looks different than the way we were used to church.
Where do you see yourself falling in that line? Yeah, like where?
Yeah, so I'm technically a millennial.
Okay.
Technically, although I'm kind of like at that cusp of where I understand Gen X really well, but I identify with the millennials a lot more. So that's kind of where I'm right in between, where I can empathize with both camps, I think.
I got it. When you went into ministry, did you ever think that you would observe culture in this type of way? Like, was that part of your theological training?
It wasn't part of my theological training, but I think it's part of my background because I didn't become a Christian to the end of college. And so I didn't grow up in that Christian world that I feel like a lot of us might take for granted. Now, obviously I went to church, my parents took me to church, and I'm familiar with like the Asian American church context, but I never really identified myself in that context. I always felt like kind of on the outskirts of it. So I was able to observe this interesting like pseudo-Christian culture that just kind of gets developed that's not really Christianity. It's oftentimes more just a Christian culture, a subculture that's there. And it's mixed in with like Asian American values. And I feel like we just kind of blend it and we think that's Christianity. But from the outside, it's like, that's just kind of strange to me. And when I became a Christian, and I kind of look at it from like, wait, well, is this really Christianity or what is this? And I realized like, oh, I have like this outside perspective, I feel, and now I'm on the inside. And so in that sense, I think it wasn't my theological training. It was like my life kind of trained me to be in a position where I could see things, I guess, a little bit differently.
Yeah, okay, well that makes sense now. Now I have this story. You didn't grow up in the church,
yeah,
which allows you to be able to see it as an outsider,
yeah,
and that perspective. Do you wish that you grew up in the church?
Sometimes I always joke, I understand grace, I think, a little better than those who are more churched, because I didn't experience grace, I feel, fully until I came into the presence of Christ and amongst his people. And my wife, though, is the opposite. I think she grew up in the church, so I'm not sure she'll like this. She presumes upon grace a bit more. But she doesn't struggle with as much sin as I do, because, habits kind of develop when you don't really have that context or compass in your life. So in some ways, I wish I grew up in the church because I could have better habits. In other ways, I'm thankful that I had the lens that I do being outside the church.
When you're speaking to people who grew up in the church versus who didn't, right?
Yeah.
Like, let's say that they're students or maybe young adults or whatever. Do you treat them differently?
Yes, I do.
And you can talk about like how should pastors then do that? Yeah. So
people grew up in the church.
So tell me your perspective and your way to do it, and also what would you say to pastors who are dealing with people who did and did not? Yeah,
for sure. I think and the reason why I feel like you should meet them differently is because this is what I experienced. I'm not at like a 5 in churchiness when people talk to me. I was like at a 2, but they were talking to me as if I was at a 5. So they were presuming like a moral compass upon me and a type of belief of God upon me that I just did not agree with yet. So a lot of presuppositions there, we weren't on the same page. But when they met me at where they were at or where they wanted me to be, and I was here, there's too much of a gap for us to even talk to each other or be on the same page. versus, it's very, incarnational ministry is when Jesus comes to where you're at. Like, where are you at in your journey in life? And he meets you there. And we see that not just with Jesus, but even with his followers, like the Apostle Paul, when he talks in the book of Acts, in Acts 17, when he goes to the Jews, he talks to them a certain way based upon their understanding of the revelation of God. Versus when he talks to the Greeks, when he talks to those who don't know God, he talks to them in a different way. And so you kind of meet them where they're at, not where you're at. And I feel like that's incarnational ministry. So we should talk to them wherever they are at and try to meet them there.
Can you tell me about your story? When did you become a Christian?
Yeah, I got exposed to Christianity my whole life, and I was actually a nominal Catholic most of my life, and so that was kind of my background. Surprisingly enough, my first encounter with like Protestants, it was in college, and they're like, "Oh, you're not. Are you a Christian?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm Catholic." Like, that's not a real Christian. And I'm like, what? Like, I thought we're the same thing. And they try to do the evangelism thing to me and the spiritual laws and so forth. And I actually think I became a Christian in spite of a lot of those types of encounters that were there. Probably my first experience with Christianity where I was really curious about who Jesus was with readings of C.S. Lewis. And the way he kind of approached Jesus was just really different than kind of the packaged evangelical presentations of the gospel. And then, to be honest, in the midst of like researching and reading, I just found a loving community. Like, there were people on campus who, their evangelism was not good, but the love was great. Like, they invited me into their life, they heard my problems, and they cared about me. And so I think actually through the process of being in that community, the truth of the gospel kind of slowly hit my heart. And so that happened from freshman year all the way to the end of college. And at the end of college, I became a Christian.
Wow, that's amazing. You said that it was through a college ministry, or a campus ministry. Is that what you said?
I would say it's more through different. They were in campus ministries, but it was more just like my friends and people who I rubbed shoulders with.
Okay, and it was like relational aspects.
Very relational.
Okay.
Yep.
Does that have implications for the church?
100%. Yes, 100%. I think in our brains, we have an order of how salvation should work with people, where you entice them with like pizza or like these free nights of food, and they come, and then somehow in the midst of that you share the gospel, and they get penetrated in their hearts, and then they become they repent and they get baptized, and then they join your church as a member, and they grow in their Bible theology, and they become a Christian. Again, that's like kind of the ideal scenario, and sometimes that's the way it goes. But God works not in a box. I think God works in interesting ways, and I find that oftentimes people they are drawn not to God, nor are they drawn naturally to doctrine, but they're drawn to people. And it doesn't stay there, but that's why Jesus talks about how my disciples, they'll know you for your love. And I think it's that type of community that actually first makes people attracted at times, and that was the case for me. And in the midst of that, you're kind of journeying with them, like, why are they together? Why do they love in this way? Why do they love me in this way? And so my situation was completely opposite of that standard like gospel moment. It became I got included in the community, they loved me, and something about that in the process I came to know Jesus. And again, I think my main takeaway for that is God works in different ways for every single person. Don't put it in a box. Every story is different.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'm getting a really big context now for your story, but also for what you write. And for here at SOLA, at the conference, you did a panel, right, on sexual abuse in the church. And I know for the website, you wrote a couple articles as well. Let me pull them up right here. Why does spiritual abuse take place in a church? Spiritual abuse, why the church needs to talk about this problem. So, we've been talking about, the racial aspect of church. We've been talking about how you didn't grow up in church, but you you have that, you have the Protestants or whatever, right? Why these subjects to write about?
Oh, like not just those, but in general, everything?
Yeah, like this type of calling out the church, I want to say, in a certain way. Is that accurate? Like
calling out the church, that's a good one. That could be what I'm doing.
Maybe making them face the reality of what's going on, that.
Yeah.
Because I'm seeing a picture of somebody that didn't grow up, right, in the church, but you're able to observe, right, the culture and church culture specifically, and you're able to see, hey, there's stuff that's not right here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's why I say you're calling it out.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can feel free to say what you think you're doing, I guess.
Sure. I think, I'm at Enneagram 5, and so that's a kind of the weird one who investigates and so forth, and we just like to observe life. And I always joke, like, I like to notice things, and I especially notice problems. I don't have any solutions, but I definitely could point out a lot of problems. And I think in the church context, the feeling that we have is we have all the answers. And the answer is clearly here, it's in the verse, and so forth. And on the one hand, of course I believe in objective truth. God is truth, and Scripture is truth. But God is also mysterious. There's also a lot of wonder and awe. And when you read the wisdom books, a lot of the wisdom books is about you can't figure out God. You can't put him in a box. You can't put him in a theological category. He's revealed, and yet there is a lot to explore. And I feel like a lot of modern evangelical thought when it comes to cultural issues, we kind of feel like we figured it out and we know exactly what God has to say. And I'm just like, I don't know if that's true. And I don't know if we thought about this enough. And that's what the topics that are most interesting to me are the topics that are not talked about a lot. Because those are things that I feel the culture's talking about it, but the church has so much more to say. And just to presume that we already know what the answer is, I think that's not really growing. And I also think topics that we thought we understood, I feel like those intrigue me because I want to re-explore it because maybe the answers we thought were there, they're actually a little superficial or they're not reaching the context that the current culture is in right now. And so those are the things that catch my eye a lot.
Yeah, and I appreciate about what you said about how we the culture's talking about something, but maybe the church needs to address it.
Yep.
One of your most popular articles, or the most popular article on our website is What's Wrong with Sex Before Marriage or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So
bunch of perverts or what?
So people
you
can
take that
out. People can read that. But what was your mindset with that? I mean, I'm going to write this article. What was your driving factor behind that and putting it out there?
Yeah, that was like an example of one of those topics that we think we know what Christians have to say about it. It just don't have sex, like it's bad, and that's not what Christianity says at all. It's so much more nuanced and rich and beautiful about what it says about sex. And in contrast, we kind of see the culture talking about sex in a way that feels liberating and free, versus the way I see it is actually very enslaving and very broken. Versus what God has to say about sex. It tends to be something that offers freedom and beauty in a way that I feel like people can't really sometimes understand because it's reaching this deepness of what sex really means. And so that was kind of driving motivation, is talking about something that's beautiful that I feel like maybe Christians, we haven't really nuanced it well enough for people to catch on. And so again, I enjoy talking about that, showing the nuances and the beauty of those topics.
Yeah, thank you for writing it.
Yeah.
If you don't do it, I don't know who's going to do it.
That's right.
For the church, when should these types of things be addressed? Should they be addressed? Is it appropriate for the pulpit? What would you say?
Well, people are going to talk about it no matter what. They already are talking about it. And so one thing that I firmly believe is God, he speaks in all things. The Bible and the creator of the universe has something to say about all aspects of life. And so in my opinion, the public square is, you need more Christian voices there. Your question is should we talk about it as a church? And I think on the one hand, you don't want to be like a TED Talk on Sundays because we're not driven by the culture's agenda. But on the other hand, if you're not paying attention to what the culture is saying about things, then you're not really helping your people to be equipped into the world. And And I feel like that's a big thing that we need to pay attention to, or don't just equip them to do churchy stuff, but the whole purpose of the gathering of the saints is so that you equip them to go out into the world and be salt and light there. And so we have to address the things that are actually happening in the world, but look at it in a way that's that God looks at it, not being formed in the way that the world's forming us. So that's kind of how I would approach that.
Talk to me about your podcast. Is that a way that you can do
Yeah,
that?
yeah. That's the podcast is. Well, one thing we said about the podcast with myself, Eugene, and Jason, we're all friends. Like, we never wanted to be like, we want to start a podcast for the sake of starting it and try to gain influence. It's like, dude, we talk this way without a mic. You know, the way, and that was one thing that we said is like, we don't want to come off like we're putting on a show. Like, we're literal friends. It's even more fun when we're off air to like have those conversations. But the literal tagline is we want to talk about church and culture and how that all mixes together with faith. And we try to tackle those things that are off the pulpit, where we try to think about, well, how does a Christian, are we thinking about these things that are going on in the culture, like friendship or Me Too movements and things like power and so forth. And so to me, that's kind of a fun thing that I hope more Christians could do. Not a podcast, but just those conversations about how faith and life intersect with each other.
What are some of the biggest blind spots you see among the older Asian American leaders? What about among the younger Asian American leaders?
The bigger blind spots of the older generation Asian American leaders, I feel a lot of us who grew up in the church, I think that's the majority, understanding where people are at, like we talked about earlier. So for example, we talked about in the panel, it's not just being against spiritual abuse, it's are you enabling it? Are you fighting against it? Do you know what that even looks like? Are you trauma sensitive? These are things that I have a lot of empathy for, because it's like new terms and a new way of engaging with people that I feel like when you're older and you're just kind of stuck in your Bible and in your congregation, you're not really aware to. But I feel like engaging in conversations with different fields outside of just biblical theology, which again, you need that, but you need to engage in other fields as well. I feel like we're maybe the older generation, they're not used to that. I think you can almost sense they're on a different page of how to do ministry. And maybe the most like quote secular like they'll go is like leadership stuff. But there's so much more, like, when it comes to, for example, mental health. Of course you want to point them to the gospel, but the pathway to that, you have to actually meet them where they're at. And so I think having that sensitivity and that kind of awareness might be one big gap that's there from the older generation. The younger generation, what's the biggest gap that's there? I always feel with Asians, maybe two things. One is we feel like we could do things better. We'll change it, and we make the same mistakes, and we have different blind spots. But the fact that we even have blind spots, I think we need to be aware of that. And I think when you get older, as a younger guy who's getting older, I could sense I definitely have blind spots, and you get humbled by that. So that's definitely one thing that's there. And I think one other thing too is we don't benefit from the generational wisdom that maybe other folks do. I think especially Asian culture, you oftentimes will try to disconnect yourself from the first gen. And so when you do that, that's great, but the generational wisdom that's passed down gets kind of lost. And I think we have lost sight of how much that helps a church and a pastor when you have generational wisdom.
There's so much perspective there. We're running out of time, so let's do one more. And culture is going to be coming at us, right? It keeps coming. I don't think that you advocate us hiding or anything like that. It seems to me like you're engaging culture head on. How would you encourage other Christians to do that with wisdom? Let's just take Turning Red, for example, right?
Yeah.
How do I analyze this movie that's coming at me?
Yeah.
That's an example, But
sure.
Yeah, for anything down the line that it's going to come at us.
I think there's, one way to do it is, again, you disengage, you create your own Christian subculture, and you don't even know what's going on. You just kind of care about your potlucks and your brother-sister appreciation nights and so forth, and your Sunday worship and serving. and that's when you're disengaging from culture. The other one is you are just kind of going head on and really like, oh, this is just the world, and you conform to culture, and that's kind of sometimes what takes place as well. There's also another sub-way like that where you bash the culture, like you wage war against it, and you confront it, and all your posts are kind of condemning what's happening in the world. But I feel it's not like complicated. When Jesus talks about you're the salt of the earth, salt is like the most common product in your pantry that you'll find, and it's meant to just be everywhere. It's nothing spectacular. He didn't say you're gonna be the steak of the earth or the wagyu. Like, it's nothing crazy. It's literally just something that's gonna enhance things and preserve things. And I think that's very telling. As Christians, we are the salt of the earth. We are meant to not do anything extraordinary, but we're meant to be a preservative in the culture. And that just means doing ordinary things, engaging in ordinary things, and that's what Jesus, I think, is calling us to do. So I don't think it's anything crazy. I don't think it's anything spectacular. I think it is intentional, but I also think it's very ordinary stuff that Christians do with the world.